Hello everyone. In this video I'm going to be going over the font asset creation process in TextMesh Pro, as well as how to create material presets and how to use them. Now for most of this video I'm going to be showing functionality that's been available in TextMesh Pro for quite some time. However, I'll also be showing some of the newer features that were just introduced in the latest release of TextMesh Pro, which is 0.1.54 Beta 3. So let's get going. The first step to creating your font asset is to import the font file in Unity. Now that font file could be a TTF file or an OTF file. And although Unity doesn't support OTC files, TextMesh Pro does work with them, but in order to be able to use them with TextMesh Pro, you'll need to make a code change to the font asset creator. Now that change is available in the user forum, or you could simply reach out to me if you do need to work with OTC files. Now once the font file is imported, or typically when I import them, I put them in the fonts folder. That way I can keep everything organized neatly. For our next step, we're going to go to the window menu and we're going to open up the TextMesh Pro Font Asset Creator. Here we can see the Font Asset Creator window and all the different options available to us. And we're going to go over each of these options one at a time. The first setting we're going to look at is the font source, and this allows us to select the font file that we would have imported that we want to work with. So in this case, I'm going to select Arial. Our next option is font size. Now for most of what you're going to be doing is you're going to be using auto sizing, and what auto sizing means is pretty simple, is given a padding size and an atlas resolution size and given a certain character selection set, TextMesh Pro is going to try to fit all those characters at the largest possible point size that it can. So if I hit generate font asset or font atlas, TextMesh Pro is doing the generation, and here we can see that it added all 99 characters in this ASCII preset, and the sampling point size that it came back with is 71 point size. The sampling point size determines the quality of your font asset. In other words, it basically determines how accurately the shape of the characters will be reproduced. So the question is, how good is this 71 sampling point size? Well, for most fonts, when you get to a sampling point size in the high 40s to 50s, you've got something that's actually pretty good. So whenever you're hitting like 71 or higher, you're pretty good and you're good to go. Now, there are fonts like Jokerman, which have like high frequency changes, or there are script type fonts that have like very acute angles. Now for those you'd probably want to push a higher sampling point size, but for the most part just aim for something in the high 60s to 70s and normally you're good to go. Now right now we used auto sizing, but there are times where you'll want to use a custom size, and I'm not going to cover that right now, but we will come back later in the video and talk about why you'd want to use custom size. Now our next option that we're going to look at is the font padding. When using any of the 4 bitmap font render modes, this padding value simply determines the amount of padding between characters. But when you're using sign distance field, either 16 or 32, this padding value determines the effective range of material properties like dilation, softness, the outline thickness, how far can the offset on the shadow go, how far can the offset on beveling, not beveling, well actually beveling, but how far can the offset go on glow. So it becomes very important. So how do you know what the right padding value is for your usage? This padding value is in pixels, and it is basically relative to your sampling point size. So basically 5 pixel over 71 means that I have an effective range on those properties of about 8%. So one way to visualize it is imagine that your offset on your shadow can go about 8% of the width of your character. And that would give you a pretty good range to work with. So why not crank up the padding to a really high value all the time so you can get like a huge range? Well, that's pretty simple. The padding value ultimately increases the space between the characters, which means now we can't fit them at the same point size. So for example, if I increase the sample or the padding value and I regenerate the font asset, we're going to go from a 71 sampling point size down to something like maybe 57 or Yeah, actually, like 57. So now what it means is we've increased our effective range on those material properties so we can have a much wider shadow, our glow can go much further out, but we've done that at the expense of our sampling quality. Now in this case, we still ended up with 57, which is still going to be a nice looking font, but it is something to keep in mind. So the question is, how do you balance these two things? Well, it's quite simple, really. When you create your font asset, you have to think about how you're going to use that font. Will this font be used mostly for plain white text where you don't need much of an outline or shadow? And if that's the case, then you can get away with a smaller padding value in order to maximize the sampling point size. Or will this font be used for titles where you actually want a very large range on your shadow or on your glow or any of those material properties? And if that's the case, you're going to choose to increase your padding value at the expense of the sampling point size. And as long as your sampling point size is within an acceptable range, which is the 50 to 70 and whatever, then you're golden and you're good to go. Now, on the other end, what if you want a font to be versatile? You're not sure how you're going to use it yet? Then that effective range of 8 to 10%, I found that works good for almost all types of usage. So in the end, as a user, you're in control of how you balance these things based on your needs. The next option we're going to look at is the packing mode. And basically, fast mode, which is what I use most of the time, means as the characters are added into the font atlas texture, they are placed as best as possible, but one at a time. Whereas optimum will recursively go through them to try to really optimize the space. And what can you expect out of that? Well, you might pick up an extra 1 or 2 sampling point size, and in some cases it might make a difference, but that's pretty much what that does. The next option we're going to look at is our atlas resolution. And this one's actually driven by your padding value based on the characters you're trying to fit in your atlas and the resulting sampling point size that you want. So in this case, a sampling point size of 71 to fit 99 characters with a padding value of 5, which gives us an effective range of 8%, is good, right? That's what we're kind of looking for. But what if I want to add the extended ASCII set? Well, if I was to do this and generate the font asset, which will take a little bit longer because now we have to generate more characters, in this case, out of a potential 306 characters, we ended up with a sampling point size of 38, which is a little bit on the small size. Now, there are fonts that will look totally fine at those sizes, but I tend to want to push it more towards the 50s and 60s. So in this case, the way that I would bump up my sampling point size would be by increasing my atlas resolution. Now I could have gone to 1024 by 512, but let's just experiment with 1024 by 1024 to see what we get. So now I'm going to generate that font asset. Now it's going to take a little bit longer because now the characters will actually be bigger and there's actually more of them in this case. So we're going to wait for it to be done. I should have probably paused the video. I'll pause it on the next examples. So in this case, we ended up with a sampling point size of 98, which is actually better than the original 71 that we had. And out of the 306 characters, we got 250 of them in there. Now, side note about that data. The 306 and the 250, the reason we didn't get all 306 is we get a report here saying missing characters. And this is actually accurate, which means the font that I'm using, Arial, is actually missing the characters that are reported here. And this is an important side note, which is a lot of users or a lot of us are going to use like font viewers on the Mac or on Windows. And basically a lot of those font viewers use character substitution. And this misleads users into thinking that some characters are actually in a font where in reality they're not. So the important point here is this report is accurate. If it tells you that a character is missing, it is truly missing and not in that font. Now, the 250 versus 306, how do you know if it's not missing because it didn't fit? Well, the way that auto sizing works is it will keep increasing the size or reducing the size to try to fit everything. So unless the sampling point size is 1, you know that it tried to fit everything that was available in the font on your list. So you can trust this report to give you the information that you need. So back to our atlas resolution stuff. So in this case, hey, we end up with a 1K basically, so at this point, we're looking at a 1 MB font atlas, and we have a nice sampling point size, which is 98, but there's an issue. The issue is now our font padding value, which is 5 pixels, it's 5 pixels out of 98, which means our effective range on those properties now is half of what it used to be, or less than the 71 that we had. So for this type of application, I would tend to push that to maybe 8 or 9 so that I could get about the same 8 to 10% range that I wanted. And in this case, I'm going to hit generate and pause the video so we don't stare at the progress bar. So now that the font's been generated, we can see that with a padding value of 9, we actually ended up with a sampling point size of 83, which is actually better than the original 5 versus 71. So we've actually got really good range and an improved sampling point size. So this would be a good font asset to work with. So the Atlas resolution, you can go from 16 by 16 if you want to include just a few characters, all the way to an 8K by 8K. Please be aware that mobile devices, a lot of them, or the older ones, are limited to 2K by 2K textures. Newer hardware supports up to 4K by 4K, but in a 4K by 4K, you can fit like thousands of characters. At 36 points, I can fit 11,272, basically all the Hangul Korean characters. But you don't need to create assets of that size. But if you wanted to, you could. So 2 quick tips. When you're working with a font asset and you find yourself constantly pushing the material property values to their maximum range, so in the case of the shadow offset, you'd be like pushing it to a value of 1 and a -1, that basically is a sign that your padding value is probably too small because you're constantly trying to reach to that maximum. So my suggestion would be to regenerate that font asset with a larger padding value. Now, another side effect of going to those maximum values is you have to keep in mind that when you're going to the maximum value of the padding, you're right against the adjacent character and you can get some artifacting. So typically I tend to stick to values of, like, when I'm using a font asset and I get to 0.7 and 0.8 and I feel good about that range for whatever effect I'm trying to get, that's a good sign. If I'm constantly going to 1, let's regenerate it and increase the padding. The second tip is there's actually a side effect to having a padding value that's too small. And there's an FAQ on the TextMesh Pro user forum that covers a lot of the common stuff. One of them is users saying, hey, when I zoom out and the text gets small, there's some weird ghost or transparency around the character. And that's a sign that your padding value is too small for basically your sampling point size. And that means that in terms of the sign distance fill computations, we're getting at a point where we're getting erroneous data because the padding is too small and the distance field data is too little. So when you see that, that's the other sign that you should regenerate your font asset and increase your padding value. And that's the 2 tips. And now let's take a look at the next option. The next option we're going to look at is our character set selection. Now, we've already seen that we can select ASCII, which is 99 characters. We can choose extended ASCII, which is all the characters visible on screen here, plus the following ones that are missing from this Arial font. We can pick lowercase, uppercase, numbers and symbols. These are basically presets that contain a predefined list of characters. The options I'm going to be focusing on are the remaining 4, which are quite versatile. So the first one we'll look at is custom characters. So custom characters brings up this input box where you can type or copy paste the characters you want to include in your font asset. And that's pretty powerful and flexible. But in the latest release of TextMesh Pro, I added this new option here, which allows you to retrieve characters from an existing font asset. So for example, if I wanted to regenerate my Arial SDF font asset because I wanted to increase or decrease the padding value or change any of the settings, now I can select existing font assets and retrieve the characters that are included in that font asset. And then I can easily add or remove characters to modify this font asset. And this is a nice workflow improvement over the previous release of TextMesh Pro because now it makes it very easy to manage all your different font assets, to add or remove characters Or if I wanted to create another font asset and make sure it also contained the same characters that another one contained, like let's say I said I want to regenerate my Arial SDF, but I want to have the same characters as bangers, well, I could select the other font asset and it gives me those characters. Now, in terms of regenerating a font asset, as you do this, so if I wanted to regenerate Arial SDF to add or remove characters, I would select the original font file, which is Arial TTF. I would pull up the characters that it has, which are these ones. I would make my addition. I would regenerate the font atlas, and then when you choose Save TextMesh Pro Font Asset, I would override or save over the existing one, which not only would update the existing one, but it would also update any of the material presets that I've already created. And I'm going to cover material presets later on in this video. But this is a nice workflow improvement again to help you manage all these font assets. So the next option I'm going to look at is your custom range. So custom range is similar. So instead of seeing the characters themselves, you can see the range of characters that are included in this font asset. And these are defined in decimal value. And the way you type these ranges, it's basically, from 32 to 126. Then comma would be the next range that you're going to define. So from 160 to 255, for example, and you would just type all your different ranges there. The next option to look at is the Unicode range. Unicode range is the same as the other one, except it uses hexadecimal value. And the reason why it's there is if you go to the unicode.org website, where you can look up the chart for all the different languages to figure out where they're mapped in the Unicode, all the values and the ranges are defined in hexadecimal. So this is an easy way for you to be able to look up your given language and to put in the effective range that you need in order to have all those characters in there. Now, the next option I'm going to cover is the characters from file, which is very important. So when it comes to localization, most studios are going to be using what we call language files. So basically they have a bunch of text files that contain all the text used in their project or game. Now, they use those text files to send them to different companies who are going to be doing the translation, or to other employees who are doing the translation or proofing of the copy and the text to make sure there's no typos and so on and so forth. Well, larger studios and users who do localization use basically language files, and using those language files, you can use the characters from file and input a text file that contains all the characters for, let's say, a given language or a set of languages, and generate your font asset and make sure that all those characters are going to be included in that font asset. It's good if you pre-parse that ahead of time where you don't have duplicate characters, but even if you don't pre-parse the list to only have unique characters, TextMesh Pro will strip out duplicates anyway. But it's always good if you know exactly what characters you have. Now, as a general observation and note, there's a preconceived notion that when you have a game that's text heavy, that you're going to end up with a lot of characters, and in reality you'd be shocked that that's not the case. There's almost no title or no game out there that uses more than 1,000 characters. And when I'm saying 1,000 characters, we're mostly talking about Chinese, Japanese, or Korean, who have much larger character set, because when we're dealing with Latin based languages or Cyrillic, our alphabet and our character set is actually pretty small. I had a user recently send me his text files for all of his languages, and 23 languages were covered in there. When I looked at all Latin-based languages and extracted all the unique characters for the it was a large amount of text for their game, I ended up with 93 characters for all those languages combined together. When I looked at simplified and traditional Chinese, which we know those character sets are huge, I ended up with 441 characters. So in the end, most people think, oh, when it comes to Chinese, Japanese, Korean, and some of those languages, I need dynamic fonts. That's not the case. All you need is to make sure you include all those characters in there, and you'd be surprised to discover that almost no title uses more than 1,000 character. And when I talked about being able to generate a font atlas that's like 2K by 2K or 4K by 4K, in a 2K by 2K you can already pack thousands of characters. So for any given title, my recommendation is to group your languages in different font assets. So basically all your Latin-based languages, French, English, Dutch, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, and so on and so forth, and Cyrillic, and a bunch of other languages, all fit within a single font asset. Then for Chinese, Japanese, and Korean, I would group simplified Chinese and traditional Chinese in one, Korean in another one, and basically Japanese in another one. And in theory, you would end up with 4 font assets, and that should cover pretty much all the languages you wanted to cover. Now, right now we're talking about including all characters in a single font asset, but later on I'm going to be talking about the font fallback system that was introduced in TextMesh Pro that allows you to split those characters amongst different font assets to give you even more flexibility. But I've been talking about this option now for 7 minutes, so I'm going to move on to something else. Oh, and I forgot, for your right to left base languages, I would either group them into their own font asset, or depending on how many characters you end up with on your Latin side, because again, even the right to left languages don't contain that many characters, you could also group them into your Latin based languages. So it all depends again on how many characters you end up with. The next option I'm going to cover is the font style. And basically this allows you to embolden text or create italic text, or in this case, if I choose outline, I'll change my font asset size, the font atlas I mean, and reset my padding and go back to my ASCII set and regenerate that font asset. And you'll see that it gives me an outline, and the value here allows you to make the outline thicker or thinner. And in all honesty, I don't really use these options anymore, as there's different ways to do that. The outline's kind of cool, but the other stuff, I don't tend to use it. But hey, it's an option and it's in there. The next option I'm going to cover is the font render modes, and the first 4 are bitmap render modes. And TextMesh Pro does support bitmap fonts, and all of the rich text tag and the text formatting and text layout capabilities do work with bitmap fonts. And bitmap fonts do have their place in the world, and they're most effective when you're trying to render small text on screen, and by small I mean from 8 to maybe 14 point size or 16. And a bitmap font using hinting will render best at those small sizes when it's rendered 1:1, which means that 14 point will look best when it's rendered at 14 point on screen. It doesn't really scale, so if you wanted to display a bitmap font at a bunch of different sizes, your font atlas would have to contain a copy of each of the characters used for each of those sizes. So if you were to look at Unity's dynamic font system and take a look at the font atlas, and displaying a bunch of text at different sizes, you'd realize and you'd see duplicates of all the characters in that font atlas, and you'd be surprised how quickly that font asset or that font texture atlas scales to 2K to a 4K texture. It takes no time to scale there, and the characters are not really packed efficiently because you have duplicates of all that. By contrast, a sign distance field font at small size won't render as well, but the differences can be very marginal and subtle in some cases where most user will not even notice it. But by contrast, the sign distance field is much more flexible, because first you only need one copy of each character in the font atlas at the sampling resolution that we talked about. Let me make this go away here. But at the sampling point size that we talked about, so only one of each, so it's much more effective. You can pack a lot more characters for any given languages, but more importantly, they scale perfectly at any point size and resolution. So by contrast, your bitmap, you end up with a bunch of copies for each of the characters for each of the point size you're using. So in addition, the sign distance fill gives you the ability to add the outline, the dilation, the softness, the bevel, the glow, and all the shadow and all the rest of the stuff. So for me, personally, I find distance field renders as good with small point sizes, renders better as it increases in size, and then becomes much more flexible as you go forward. Now, the next options are the distance field 16 and 32, and what this means, the 16 and 32 are oversampling, which means that 63, the distance field was actually computed on an image of each character at 63 times 16. I'm not going to attempt to do the math, or at 32. So when should you use one versus the other? Um, Obviously, computing the signed distance field at 32 will take much longer than computing it at 16. And for most of the fonts, the difference between the two will be marginal. I mean, it's going to be hard to notice. But if you're using a font with high frequency changes or a script text with acute angles, that 32 can make a difference. So again, it's up to you to play with these things, and if the font looks good to you on screen and you work with it and it looks fine, then guess what? It looks fine. You don't need to mess with it. If you're looking for ways to tweak it and make it look a little bit better, then hey, you can look at the distance field 32. I could have added a distance field 64, but at 64, we're now at the precision limit for basically 8-bit alpha. So there's no point adding 64. So that covers our font render mode. The next option is basically get kerning pairs. So as you generate your font asset, if you do want to extract the kerning pairs, you have to click that button to turn it on, and that's basically it. So the next stuff is we've already seen generate font atlas. It generates it. You get a list of the sampling point size, all the characters that are in there, and a list of all the missing characters. You can copy paste. If I copy paste in this list, I can paste it in some other, like in Word or some other document. And then Save Font Asset will bring up a save menu, allowing you to save the font asset in whatever location you want inside the asset folder, like somewhere in the project. And if you're looking to override or regenerate a font asset, then you would save over it. And as you save over it, it would automatically update all the material presets that you've created for that given font asset. So this concludes the portion of the video that covers the font asset creator. If you have any questions about this stuff, feel free to reply or post on the user forum. I'm going to move on now and talk about the next stuff, which is the, let's see, the material presets.